Good evening and welcome to Alan's Italy. Tonight we have a very special guest with us whom I'd like to introduce you now. Her name is Dr. Eve Dombra, who is Professor of Art at Vassar College. Eve, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
This is the evening when I talk about one of my favorite topics, which is the Roman Forum. I've been to the Roman Forum many times over the course of my 12 or 13 times that I've been to Rome. It's an absolutely fascinating place, and we were discussing just before the fact that Pompeii has a better reputation for more well-preserved monuments and houses, which shows how the people lived during that time. But the Roman Forum, to me, has always been more of a site of history, a lot of the history that took place during the Roman Empire. So without further ado, let's go to starting with this. And so the first thing we're looking at here is a map of the city of Rome. It's actually not a map of the entire city of Rome. This is more a map of the Centro area, which is the area of most tourist importance. Most people who go to Rome spend most of their time in this area. And you can see that circle right over there where it says Foro Romano is the Roman Forum. So that's where it's located. And I've taken you on tours of Rome before. And we've gone to the Vatican, and there it is, upper left-hand side there, and some of the other places that we've been. And the first couple of pictures I have here are pictures of the Roman Forum as it looked 2,000 years ago. Now, to me, this is very important because, when you go to the Roman Forum, one of the things that strikes you immediately is that it's a lot of rubble and it's a lot of indistinguishable things that you really don't know exactly what they are. And one of the things I try to do is bring with me a picture or something like this where I could actually look at this and say, well, gee, this is the way it looked 2,000 years ago. And this is, this is really where you are, where you're standing, this incredible location. So is this the way it really looked?
Well, it's handsome. It looks very classical. To me, it looks overbuilt. In the center, you see the speaker's platform, the rostra. So I think that's where we need to think of the Roman Forum, not just as an outdoor history museum, but as a kind of living and breathing center of Roman life. So this reminds me of the type of images you would find in kind of flip books, tourist books.
Right.
Yes, it probably later, not to make little of it, probably in the later empire, towards the end of the classical Roman period, 3rd or 4th century, it may very well have looked so overbuilt. But actually, at the very beginning, it may have looked sort of more or less what it looks like now, in that it was a valley, marshy, swampy, with a stream through it. And at the very beginning, what we think of the beginning of the development of Rome, traditionally 8th century, right? It was the common area, the valley between the various hills. And the early settlers of Rome lived on hilltops, and then came in the valley in between, the valley we know as the Forum, the lowland, marshy, some of it had garbage, swamps, sewage, then became a place where they not only buried dead, but came in common, marketplace, right? And we see it, then it gradually became a city center.
They buried dead here?
Well, yeah, there are some very early burials there.
Is that
Traditionally, burials were later out of the city.
Yes. Yeah.
But there's some very early graves, very early, before it became settled as a city center. So part of that swamp was diverted underground as the great drain, the sewer of Imperial Rome, the Cloaca Maxima. They drained it. And it became, a common area. So what I see here is the political heart, the rostra, the speaker's platform.
Right.
Right.
That's right. Let me just show
Can you
That's
point that out?
right over here.
Yeah,
It's
togate
right over there.
figures in toga. So this is an area where people congregated, speeches. It was the communications network, right? This is where politics was lived and acted out.
Is this true that it's true that if, you know, the famous speech we think that Marcus Antonius made after the death of Julius Caesar, that he stood up here and Cicero stood up there?
Well, yeah. And remember, there were a series of speakers' platform or rostra. Augustus later built another one. Julius Caesar built one. But that gives you, you notice that it's right in the, what you say, at the beginning. We can look later on the map of the square area of the Roman Forum with the Capitoline Hill rising behind it. So a lot of these gracious temples behind it gave it a kind of stage set. So it is true that, yes, for Julius Caesar's funeral, his body was brought in on a golden bier.
Is that the temple of Julius Caesar?
Yes, that's a reconstruction. Now it's a little bit of rubble. And today, where your arrow is, all you see is a little bit of concrete, semicircle. There's a little wooden shed over it today, and tourists peer.
But do you think it was that colorful with the green and red?
Well, there are examples, fragments of marbles of temples, not so much from the temple of the divine Julius Caesar, which was put up to a memorial for him, was built mid-1st century BC, slightly later. But we know in the imperial period, later 1st century, 2nd century, green and red imported marble. So polychrome was popular. So a little later, after Augustus, after the turn of the 1st century BC, a lot more color, a lot more bronze. Remember, marble statue would be placed. You have a winged victory on a globe there in the front. You'd have lots of marble statues, some of it taken as booty of war early on, the wars of expansion with the Greeks. A lot of the white marble statue that we know would have been colorfully painted for the clothing. Right? Warriors would have gilt armor. So, a lot more color,
right.
A lot more
But you're
height.
saying then that, you know, as the forum developed over the course of really 1,000 years, it was never, you know, this congested. It started out much less congested.
Well, I think it got congested,
Yeah.
but I think what would be important is not only we have politics and religion, right? Temples all around. So it's also, for moderns, it's interesting to note that it was a state religion. So politicians like Julius Caesar, like Augustus, were also priests. Right? You know, in our Western society, we might find that a little odd.
Yeah.
And there were many, many Roman gods. Right? And when Julius Caesar or Augustus wanted to take their army out to war, they would first ask the gods whether, you know, would we be successful? Are you on our side? So there would be lots of sacrifice and cults. You know, there was gods for everything, even a Roman god of mildew, right? Gods were consulted.
Is that right?
Yeah. So the temples, politics are all close together if we want to think of this as I said, a living and breathing city center, and also a marketplace. In these kind of very neoclassical reconstructions, you see the temple facades with their pediments and columns, arches, war monuments, trophies, right? The history aspect, right? One walks through here and sees the memorials of generals past, and would learn how, if you were a Roman of the 1st century AD, you would see various statues, war monuments, and you would learn how Rome became a world power, how it dominated the Mediterranean basin, plus most of Western Europe, some of the East Africa, and all that. But then earlier on, there were marketplaces, places where greengrocers brought their carts, where animals, meat, and fish sellers were. And so it got rather messy and smelly, and particularly by the mid-1st century BC, Julius Caesar wanted to clean the Roman Forum up, right? He said, we have sacred temples, we have basilicas where there were law courts, tax collectors, and right next to them we have the fishmongers throwing their scales, you know, and stinking under the sun. So he wanted his city center to be dignified, and he wanted to move the commercial aspects. But, you know, we think of life compartmentalized and a sense of urban planning. They didn't have that. You know, everything, both the commercial, the sacred, and the political took place at once in the forum. And, you know, you would meet and greet, do business, talk to your friends. If you had an issue with a
I heard there was a house of ill repute somewhere in there, is it?
Well, I think there were many. I don't know. The archaeological evidence for that would be, right, would be nil, because there are brothels in Pompeii, but you didn't really need cubicles. But you're right. Early Republican sources tell us, if you're looking for easy women, you go behind, right, even behind this temple or that.
Right.
If you're looking for the men who are going to show off and tell you how much money they have, right? So there was a lot of gossip, intrigue, scandal.
Sounds like the kind of place I would really enjoy being
Well,
in.
yeah.
But
If you wanted to know what was going on in ancient Rome, who the movers and shakers were, how to get things done, how to manipulate the law courts, right? It all happened there.
Wow.
So I think in the beginning, a swampy, marshy area. Then it became overdeveloped, and strong men like Julius Caesar, very ambitious. And remember also, Julius Caesar had traveled to the east, and he brought a notion of a Hellenistic city with a kind of more gracious cosmopolitan planning. So by the mid-1st century BC, Julius Caesar attempted to make order, to sweep out the messy merchants, people who came and sold goods off of the back of their carts, or who would set up shop in between the columns of the temples on the steps, put a blanket down and sell wares. Think of sellers on the streets of New York City, downtown. People, congregate by the museums with tables, right, not carts.
So Julius Caesar wasn't strictly, power hungry. He was, although a lot of people say that one of his ways of gaining power was to please the people by doing these public, creating public spaces and so on.
Right. Well, there's in some ways he was progressive as a man of people. He was against the old kind of aristocracy who were running Rome, as a kind of elite network of commanders who would go out to the provinces, could collect taxes, accumulate wealth, distribute the wealth that you collected there to your private army, right? And so there were some who were running Rome, originally a city that grew across the Italian peninsula, then had a large overseas empire. A lot of people were getting rich, rather quickly over that. So Julius Caesar realized that you needed a bureaucracy, right? That the structure had to change. We're not saying that he was revolutionary, but he was at various times in his career odd man out against the old aristocratic network, although of course he was, part of that too. But I think he wanted to make, Rome had just grown too quickly, and it was a world capital, but it didn't have many of the amenities of the older cities in Greece, on the coast of Turkey, what they would call Asia Minor. So he was inspired to bring some of that cosmopolitanism to Rome. So what he did, and this is an excellent image to look at, is that he wanted to systematize or make order in the Roman Forum. So if you look in the center square area, he attempted to, this is, I don't know if you can...
Yeah, and you're talking about this...
Basilica Julia.
Oh, this is the Basilica.
This is a basilica. Unfortunately, he was assassinated, killed in 44. So a lot of his plans were left to his grandnephew Augustus, right? The first emperor, the next strong man who inherited from him, and finished his building plans. But you have a Basilica Julia.
Named after Julius Caesar.
Yeah, yes, so named after his family, the Julian line. And what it is, it's an enclosed part of the forum, with a wooden roof, a central area raised higher so there are windows to let light in. For much of the year in the Mediterranean climate, business could be carried outdoors. But in the winter, it's rainy, right? It can get colder. So you wanted an indoor area. It has, it looks like columns on the outsides, columns on the interior. The Basilica of Julia had many purposes. And this is a principle of Roman architecture, is that multi-purpose buildings, even temples, could be used for. So here you could have meetings of various groups, but in the Basilica, law courts. And in the Basilica Julia, a famous court, often for inheritance and various taxes. I think it's the court sometimes of 100 judges. There may have been 180 judges. So law courts, there was also a kind of commercial exchange, money exchange taking place in various of its rooms and colonnades. And notice that it has steps and colonnades. If we look across the forum to this one called the
Yes.
Basilica Aemilia.
Right,
Notice
that's-
there's a wonderful porticus that could have been a kind of shopping arcade.
Like down
there.
here.
Yeah, with various stalls. But
I see.
yeah, in the interior, and unfortunately these two basilicas are, all is left is the pavement, but you can
Yeah.
see various
We'll
important
see
marble.
that in a few
Yeah.
minutes.
And in the Basilica Julia, if we could get there now, on the paving stones, carved into them are kind of gaming boards that show scores.
We'll come to that. I
Yeah.
think that's
and,
part of
and
it.
it's interesting 'cause what it shows is that people were waiting a long time, like they do in public municipal
Right.
halls, for their case to be called. They
Oh,
get
so they were
bored,
fooling
so they
around.
took
Yeah.
coins and they scratched into stones, like, you know, ancient forms of tic-tac-toe or hangman or a different kind of
Right,
little games. And you find it's graffiti. But
Now the Basilica Aemilia looks much larger than. I mean, is that just the?
yes, well, it was
the
rebuilt
angle?
over time. All of these buildings, and you know, when you go to the Roman Forum today, I was shocked as a student. What's standing, much of it is not ancient. It's rebuilt. A lot of it late 19th through 20th century.
Oh.
So, but the Basilicas, very little is left. But the Basilica Aemilia and the porticus that you see, the porticus was named for the grandsons Lucius and Gaius Caesar, the grandsons of Augustus, who were to reign after him had they not died very young. But we have some later Renaissance engravings of ruins that were visible, and they are one of the most gracious and beautiful buildings in Rome. So public life went indoors, right, when it was inclement, for law courts, exchanges, meetings, not the Senate House, but the kind of government they had required large spaces for meeting political life, not all of it out of doors, as we saw the speakers' platform.
So this was the Roman Forum, the part that's shaded in here, the colored in.
Well, I think it also extends this way, but this is the traditional heart
Right in the
of the
middle.
Roman
I
Forum.
see.
And you see there's a lot of other ancient shrines, the black stone, pits that were struck by lightning, which was then thought to be a sign where the god, let's say Jupiter, made his mark on earth. There were all kinds of mysterious shrines of early history. And even to a Roman of Julius Caesar's day might not even know or understand what these were. But think of it filled with various markets, impromptu stalls. And Julius Caesar cleared it out so it looks like there's a rectangular space, right? Forget the arch of Septimius Severus,
Yes.
but facing the slope of the Capitoline Hill.
I see.
And there were early buildings on these two basilicas, but notice the two basilicas as were like kind of lengthwise borders that defined the rectangular shape.
Right.
And then Julius Caesar moved the Curia or Senate House.
That's this building
right?
here.
And now we see a much later version, much of it modern and rebuilt. Again, these buildings burned with wooden roofs, replaced over time. But he built the Senate House, so the Senate would take place, and this is politically important, in a building that he renovated. Right? So the strong man who pays for buildings, pays for renovation, names them, like the Basilica Julia, after his family or his close associates, leaves his mark on history. Right? And anyone who uses or passes by these buildings are reminded of his beneficence, his generosity. Mm-hmm. And what we also note, if you look in the gray rectangle right behind the Senate
right
House.
here.
Yeah. So Julius Caesar was a master of these kind of effects. So he built a new Senate House that backed into a entirely new structure. And this is the first of the imperial fora. It wasn't enough to have a Roman fora as a civic central marketplace, but he made a squared area, and that area that you're pointing to is called the Forum of Julius Caesar. Mm-hmm. It takes its name. What is it? It's nothing but a rectangle in space, open air. Note that it's walled in. However, the Senate backs out into it.
Yes.
There's a covered colonnade, a walkway.
Right here.
And then on access, a grand temple. And that temple is dedicated to Venus Genetrix of the Vigetor, who was seen as the goddess who attends to, cares to, and Julius Caesar would say even is his ancestress.
Related to, right. Yes,
So then
I've heard
he
that.
rules by right of this divine genealogy, descended from a goddess, a very important one. Venus has long roots in Rome. And and this building, was purely a place of propaganda to his power and authority.
Now, this was the first of the imperial fora.
Right.
So there was nothing here behind. There was nothing here.
Well,
Were there other buildings
no,
at the time?
Good point. What you're looking to here is a Forum of Trajan, so
Yes.
early 2nd century. Right behind, we have this one, the Forum of Augustus, right? Who will then, by 29 BC, take over, and he's the grandnephew of Julius Caesar.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say there was nothing there, interesting. Well, there was. There was a street leading up, right, to the hills. It was a thriving commercial, residential quarter, one of lowlifes, right, of butchers, booksellers, prostitutes, crammed tenements that often burnt down, unsightly, right, urban life, thriving. So what Augustus did after Julius Caesar is, out of money, his own money, some of it could have been booty from war, he bought part of that real estate, cleared it out, and then he asserted his own power by building his own forum. And Augustus there exceeded the expectations of Julius Caesar. His temple is not to Venus, but to Mars, right, the god of war. And we know that Augustus, among his many claims, extended Roman dominion territory, pacified or attempted to pacify Northern Europe, the area of Germany, was out in Spain with his troops, even in the Middle East. So, and what Augustus did, again, same format. What is an imperial fora? But a rectangular space surrounded by a covered colonnade or walkway with the temple to your personal god. However, Augustus, by the end of the 1st century BC, turn of 1st century AD, advertised the imperial might of Rome. Talk about color. There are fragments, sources that tell us he specifically used imported marble from all over, from Greece, Turkey, the Near East, stones from Egypt, brightly colored. And the artistic program also emphasized that. In the colonnade, note, on either side there are these semicircles of the temple.
Yes,
Inside each of those, can't see much today, there are fragments of sculpture on display nearby. There were statues in niches that were all the leaders, generals, the statesmen of Rome, including Julius Caesar, from the beginning leading up to Augustus on either side. So it was a history museum of the great worthies of Rome.
There was one on the other side, too.
Yes,
Wow.
and each of them had a little inscription with their deeds, so Julius Caesar. And of course, remember, Julius Caesar, assassinated, 44, involved in a great civil war. Augustus carried it on with Mark Antony. Julius Caesar's leading colleague worked with Augustus, and then with Cleopatra, they parted ways, civil war. In this monument, the Forum of Augustus, Augustus kind of makes peace and unites them. Those who had been his enemies are also honored. He knits together the various discordant parts that made Rome. And it's also mythical. And this is part of the Roman Forum, too. The ancient heart of the Roman Forum pays tribute. As I mentioned, there are rocks with marks, the black stone, monuments that evoke the early history of Rome when gods, were present. So, too, in the Forum of Augustus, he pays court to Venus, Mars, a kind of mythic genealogy that would make them larger than life. So
did I catch that he was really he pardoned his enemies?
No, he didn't. No,
Because I know there
in
were
real war,
proscriptions
he slaughtered them.
afterwards, yeah.
But in art, right, in artifice, in
I see.
stone, he had statues in niches of many of those who were enemies, right?
Cool.
We
That's
forget
pretty
about that.
cool, yeah.
Yeah, but they were all included.
How about
and the idea is that
Pompey Magna?
and Augustus, the idea is that all of Roman history is laid out before you as you walk in the Forum
Very
of Augustus. And so you get lessons, you're educated, but these great men are also examples And all of this is focused on Augustus, his image, and there was a statue of him in the center of the forum and an inscription, Pater Patriae, father of his country. So all of the ancient past from, Aeneas, right? Virgil was writing the Aeneid in the 20s at Augustus's behest, creating a great myth like the Greek epics, right? All of this leads to Augustus, right? That it is ordained that Augustus will rise out of this and be one that brings the empire together and forward, right? All of this great history culminates in the person of Augustus.
Now let's, excuse me, I'd
Yeah.
like to just move on. This is what we're looking at, but kind of a schematic diagram
Sure,
of what
plan,
everything
yeah.
was, so you could see that was indeed.
You can see here in the Forum of Caesar, if you want, the Temple of Venus Genetrix.
Where am I pointing
Right
to?
there, you're right
here?
there.
That's
Venus,
right here,
yeah,
right.
yeah. And there's also gold and marble statues there.
Right.
Yes.
So here was the Curia over here,
Yeah, and then built in
and then right.
Senate House. And no Forum of Augustus is backed right on to the Forum of Julius
And
Caesar.
that's not an accident.
No.
He did that purposely.
Right, because he gains his power, his name. Augustus emerged on the political scene a mere youth, right? And the historians at the time said, or political men, he owes it, Cicero, all to his name, right? Julius Caesar.
Cicero said that?
I think, yes.
Is that one of the reasons?
Well, yes,
They got rid of him?
yes. If not Cicero, then other leading men of their day. And also in some of these little rooms that look like little cubicles here,
Yes,
right off of the
yes,
Forum of Caesar, some of them were shops, silver makers, right? Craftsmen. So again, you always have this kind of close proximity to various different types of occupation.
Okay, now let's, that's just another one, but I'm going to move past that. And this is a view, okay, so now this is what it looks like now. Unfortunately, this is what it looks like. This is a picture that actually Laura took
It's a beautiful
from,
one.
from the back of the Senate building on the Campidoglio, looking at the whole scope of the Roman Forum. Now, could you tell us a little bit about why and how those magnificent buildings wound up looking like this?
Oh, well.
Too bad, right?
Right,
It would have been a great Disney World kind of thing.
Right. Well, I think if you want to, the Piranesi engraving is a nice one.
Should I go to that one?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to that one
we
now.
could return that to look at the view of the Palatine.
Sure,
'Cause
but you want to go to the Piranesi.
I think if you
okay,
could,
sure.
that would.
Here we go. There we go. Okay, go
So
ahead.
yeah, and the title, the title is The Field for Cows, right? The Field of Cows. So this is engraving by Piranesi, dated to the 18th century, latter half of the 18th century. Note the ground level of the arch we saw before. It's almost up to its second story. So over time, the forum became filled in. It's the silt from the Tiber, debris, garbage. This was a central valley in Rome. I said at the very beginning, let's say the 8th century BC, it was an area of marshland, debris, maybe a few burials. It was low-lying land, not so healthy given some of the dampness in that climate, and people lived on the hills around it. After the empire, medieval period, power turned away from the west, went to the east. Parts of Rome abandoned. It was filled in. So what was it? And by Renaissance Rome, more life at the edges. Churches were built into some of the Roman ruins, but at the edges on the Palatine Hill. But the center declivity filled in, became green and blossomed, and cows, goats, shepherds, foraged there. The other interesting thing is that the beautiful marble, the expensive imported cut stone was reused. It was a great stone quarry.
Right.
So from the late medieval period onward, people went down there with shovels and pickaxes. Who owned it? Nobody owned it, right? There were no descendants there. And they just took the stone off the buildings, and many of these great stone sculptures adorned the Renaissance buildings, the Palazzo of noble families, various cathedrals and churches in Rome, the bronze doors
So
from the
nobody
Senate's
had
house,
a sense of history here.
St. John Lateran.
Nobody had a sense of history
Well,
in
it
the Middle
wasn't-
Ages to say, let's kind of keep at least one,
Well,
you know, three square blocks of the way
Well-
it was, so people.
Well, is it a
posterity-
compliment? They built so well. It lasted. These were beautiful materials. The bronze doors of the Senate House, I think, are in St. John Lateran. They saved it by reusing it, you could say.
Right.
Yet Latin remained as the scholarly language, the language of the church, right? But the Roman Empire, per se, was no more. So, and some of the buildings, like the Arch of Titus on the other end, even part of the great arches, were built in as medieval fortresses. So they became the core of other building. And we see are these figures with pickaxes in the front left there?
Perhaps, yep.
Yeah, yeah. Are they going
look
around?
They look like they're workers going to work.
Yeah.
So they must be doing some kind of.
Right.
I could see them like digging here and
Yeah.
pickaxes. Yeah.
Yeah, and often in some of these, there's like laundry lot. There's laundry lines.
It looks like a dump.
Yeah. And there's trees, right? So it became a kind of hollow center of ancient Rome. You can see the Colosseum in the background.
Yes.
So that's what happened. And look at this, right? Temple. There's almost everything's underground.
Yeah.
So what happened by the later 19th century and 20th century, the modern exploration of ancient Rome, these things were dug up, right? And you would think by digging up, where they preserved them? Well, then you expose them to the air, atmospheric pollution. Teams of archaeologists, international groups with shovels, spades, pickaxes went into the forum. So some things were exposed, carted away to museums for safekeeping. With the beginning of the modern, after the Grand Tour, 18th century, a lot of the things that we see are completely rebuilt, right? So in rebuilding them, like the Temple of Vesta, the Portico of the Harmonious Gods, you get a pastiche. Some of this, little bits and pieces of marbles from different centuries being put together. Some of this happened actually even in later antiquity. Some of the, by the 4th, 5th century, some of the great old temples were just put together, hobbled together from marble that was on the ground.
Okay, so this is actually the view that we were looking at before.
Sure.
And this is the 18th century.
Yeah, from the Capitoline out.
And this is what it looks like now.
Right.
So it's been cleaned up.
But
They
is there
dug
a lot
out.
more? Yeah.
Yeah, they dug out all the debris.
Yeah, and
you know,
we're
for
at the
most
ground
part.
level. You can see ancient pavements. You see sheds covering in the
Yeah.
back of the rostra, right there.
Over here.
There are sheds.
Over here.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Today, if you go to the Imperial Fora, there are excavations, areas where you can look down into the margins of the Imperial Fora. For the year 2000, the Jubilee year of the Vatican, they attempted to excavate more of the great Forum of Julius Caesar, Augustus, near the Forum of Trajan, which hadn't been properly excavated. The original excavation of those took place in the early 20th century, part of it coinciding with the 30s, with fascist Italy. And the idea was to look at those areas quickly, and then Mussolini and his cohorts wanted to pave over a great road alongside the Roman Forum. So they covered over parts of the Imperial Fora to make a triumphal way. As the Roman emperors had a triumphal way through the Via Sacra, right through this great arch of Septimius Severus, the central bay that you see here.
Yes.
Mussolini wanted a great roadway for his tanks and armor and material next to it. So they did a very quick excavation of Julius Caesar's Forum, and Augustus then covered it over. And this was reopened.
But the
in
Via
year
dei
2000.
Fori Imperiale, let's go back to
Yeah,
this.
that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, the
that's
Mussolini.
so.
Yeah.
In other words, the Via dei Fori Imperiale went right through here, right?
Yeah.
It was kind of like right over here. So he
Yeah.
just kind of knocked all this down, whatever was left, I guess.
Well,
at that time in
yeah,
1930.
they were old. It was Via Alessandrini, I think. It was houses, apartments. I think parts of it were a popular working class quarter.
Yeah.
So he flattened that. He did send archaeologists, some of them very good, but they had to work quickly, and then he covered it over. And today, you would look at pockets of those imperial fora, and there, you look down from the street level. But now, did you see it in your last trip? There are areas where it's opened up, and it's possible to take tours and to go down to the floor level.
Not the trip we just took in 2012, but the one we took in 2010 we did.
You were in Rome quickly. So there,
Yeah, we did a
attempts to
fast
ameliorate. So, different, because of the political uses of the past, right, has made the monuments sometimes more visible and sometimes less visible, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot has always been at stake, for Imperial Rome.
Yes.
And Mussolini, would like to see, he attempted to have a world empire in North Africa and beyond, right? And he wanted to glorify his regime in that way. So he used.
I read one story where he used to ride in his open car from, the Via dei Fori Imperiali. I don't have it really on here, but it goes from the Colosseum
Yes.
to the Piazza Venezia,
Sure.
and then he would go up into that balcony and
palace.
make his speeches
Yes.
From that point. So it was
Right,
kind of
right.
like this whole procession would wind up there, and then he would make his famous
Yeah.
speeches.
So he had a triumphal way,
Yeah.
and right on the other side of it were the monuments of ancient Rome.
Right. hmm Okay. Let's. This is another view. This is actually. How are we looking at this now? We're looking
Well,
towards the north.
well,
Right.
here's the arch of Septimius
right. Here's the arch that
Severus,
we were looking at
the
from the
Senate
other
House.
direction. So here's the arch. Let me show my viewers. This is the arch we were just looking at from up here. The picture we had taken was from here, up around here, looking in this direction. So now we're actually on the Palatine Hill, probably.
Yes.
Looking to the north, down at
Which
the
is an
Forum.
interesting, I think, up the Palatine Hill, right, it gets its name palace, it becomes the home, the seat of emperors. But in Julius Caesar's day, in the 1st century BC, it was always an area of prime real estate for the wealthy, and then, of course, in Rome, that meant the political class. And I think it's kind of interesting because today we think if you're a captain of industry, if you're powerful and successful, you want the estate with guards, complete privacy, or the Manhattan penthouse far above the crowd. But not in Rome. They lived right above the Forum with a view of the Forum, and they wanted to be seen. There's an interesting quotation, I think 1st century BC, of a senator who hired an architect to build a house for him on the Palatine Hill. And this architect may have been a Greek. Often there were Greek slaves taken in war, talented, good at art, the Romans thought, but maybe, intellectuals, but they'll work for us. And this architect tells the Roman senator, I'll build you a fabulous house. We'll have great doors. We'll seal it off so you'll have complete privacy. No one will be able to look up from the Forum and see you. The Roman senator says, absolutely not. That's not what I want. When I open my doors in the morning, I want all of Rome to look into my splendid house. And furthermore, I want people to come in, that is his kind of dependents, ex-slaves, freedmen, those of his political partisans would come into home office hours. I want them to see how my courtyard is thronged. That means I'm a powerful man.
Right.
People need me. They need to come to my house
see.
and ask
see.
for political advice or favors. So no, this idea of privacy, of being far away from downtown where it's quiet. No, yes, Romans had villas. They had their country estates. The wealthy had more than
Outside
one
of
house.
Rome.
But in the city, that idea of privacy and of zoning, different areas for religious, commercial. No, you wanted to be right there. You wanted to be able to get down to the Forum. If someone was attacking you on the rostra in a law court, you wanted to get down there with your retinue, your crowd of followers, right? And so there was this kind of immediacy and visibility for the wealthy.
Wow. And this is the view they had. pretty
Yes,
much. This is
it's
what
a
we're looking at
fabulous
now.
view.
Yeah.
You can imagine a fabulous view.
Okay, let's go to another one. This is the Piranesi. Okay, so this is another view. This is actually from probably a similar vantage point, right? Well, we're still looking towards the Colosseum, so we're still up on
the Capitol line.
on
We're,
the
a little,
Capitol
we're a little
line.
to the right.
a little
I think,
to the right, looking more
Yeah.
towards the north.
Yeah. So I think we're looking down these, this sad area that looks like flattened columns and pavements. I think we're getting a little bit of the Basilica Julia.
Right.
And then the central area of the Forum where there were honorary columns. Remember, a lot of these were built in the late Imperial.
So here's where the Basilica Julia was.
I think, right down in
Right
here.
down in here, right,
yeah.
okay.
And then we have a little bit of the Temple of Vesta and then the three columns
Right.
of the Temple of now, the Temple of Castor there is interesting. It was a large temple. You see only three columns, and part of the moldings are entablature. So you can imagine, if we think 10 to 12, that was an enormous temple. It was rebuilt, I think, early 1st century. Beautiful architectural.
Right.
You can see the finesse of it. But it dates back to the 5th century BC. So that's close to the beginnings of Rome. And Castor and Pollux, who were they? Not political leaders, not generals, but they are kind of semi-mythic heroes. And the story goes, they appeared on white horses in a little lake or a kind of a little pond in the forum, and they appeared in a vision to announce a victory at a battle north of Rome. Early on in the 5th century BC, Romans were fighting communities, other people on the Italian peninsula for dominion of the Italian peninsula before they moved out in Europe and across the Mediterranean. And this is one of the key battles. And so these mythic characters appeared like knights on white horses, and lo and behold, the Romans won. So they had a temple in their honor. So this is, it's a touchstone of history, right? That the gods were on their side. And what's interesting, and then Augustus and I think, or Tiberius, sometime in AD 6 or 10, it was rebuilt and given a more fabulous structure. It was raised with a large platform or steps. Speakers could, impromptu political speakers could stand on the steps, and you'd have another platform. And what's interesting in the archaeological excavation, since it was built on a large foundation, within its foundation, the substructures were found lots of individual rooms. Some of them appeared to be bank vaults or storage, and one of them appeared to have equipment that a dentist could have used.
Is that right?
So interesting mixed use. So, and there are Republican sources about people toting their coins, their wealth to the Temple of Castor to deposit it. So it also, was a kind of bank or a security vault. One would imagine that, that the priests and personnel of the temple. But so mythic.
So it was called a temple. But yeah, and the way we think of temples is we think of temples as kind of a place to worship. But then a temple was simply dedicated to some famous event, but used
Or
for
God.
practical purposes.
Yeah, and this guy, God. Yeah, lots of.
I
And
see.
the idea is that we think of worshiping inside. Greeks and Romans, no, right? What happened inside? The worship happened outside. There were no pews. In fact, the general public wouldn't enter the interior of the temple.
Right.
The kind of interesting. The temple often marked a spot. For the Greek temples, they're often on an acropolis, a height. The Romans in the city, you built a big foundation because the Temple of Castor had to stand over the forum. You'd want it to be seen. But what was inside the temple? Well, a cult statue to Castor, his twin Pollux. Doors would be shut. What would be in the temple? Think of the temple itself. I said a bank vault underneath, but the temple chamber with a statue of the god or hero. It would be opened on feast days. You could see a gleaming statue of Castor. Closed most of the time because inside the temple would be valuable material, loot. People who want to pay tribute or want a favor from Castor would give a gold and silver candelabra, basin, other material, and you deposit that at the temple. So these temples became wealthy kind of depositories of gold and silver, so they had to be locked. They had to have attendants. They were only opened on feast days, and the public didn't worship by going inside. You stayed outside. If there were offerings or sacrifices, and again, ancient religion was a bloody business. Sacrifice animals, bulls, steers, etc., slit their throats outside the temple before the steps. There'd be an altar. Meat would be distributed to the people. The inedible parts given to the gods, right? So they were very practical about that. So the temple stood on a sacred spot, marked the landscape, and it became sort of like a bank vault, right? A jewel box. But you didn't go inside to worship. You were, for the most part, outside. The only people who actually could go inside were very privileged priests. Remember, the priests were politicians too, political office. However, and then they had these very functional underneath these kind of cubicles, storage rooms, right? So you could have a variety of different businesses.
Tell me what the Pontifex Maximus.
Oh, well, that was the
Julius Caesar held that position.
So it's it's the chief priest, right? We may think in the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, right? Not political, but clearly plays some role on the political stage. So the chief of the Roman state was also the chief priest of their state religion.
I
So
see.
great priest Pontifex Maximus, and if we look behind the Temple of Vesta,
Right.
there are
So
some
here's
ruins.
the Temple of Vesta behind there.
The priest had a house.
Right.
It's called the Regia. It goes way back to the early days of the Forum.
Let me get a different angle here. This is
Okay. Yeah.
is
that's
this
good.
is this a better angle? Because here's the Temple
yeah.
of Vesta over here. Now, so where was the Regia?
I think we're looking at that's the remains
That's-
of that Temple of Divine Julius Caesar.
Oh, right,
So over
uh-huh.
behind here we get
I
there.
see.
There's not much, a little brick.
Yeah.
But that you hear, although temples are erected throughout the Roman Forum, here you have the Regia, the Temple of Vesta, and
Right.
then the atrium where in Vesta.
Okay. Now this is. I want to go to the close-up picture. Well, you want to discuss this now because this is one of my favorite.
Okay.
We're sort of running out of time.
All right,
a
we will
little.
get to it if it's your favorite. We will get to.
But we could. Do
So
we
we
have a
could
better
say,
picture of that? The House of the Vestals is one of my
yeah.
favorite.
Okay, I
So
think
let
you
me-
had
do we have
one
better-
coming up.
Well, let me. Well, that's one view of it, right?
Yeah, you could stay there.
Okay, go ahead.
Vesta is the goddess of the hearth, right? And in that little semicircular shrine you just showed, we can go back to it, but not now. It doesn't work.
Okay.
Most of that was put together in the 1930s. So again, another example of a modern recreation of some fragments where we're there. But the Temple of Vesta, a little shrine, and then there were priestesses. They were young girls, often 10 to 13, who were Vestal Virgins. The goddess was Vesta, goddess of the hearth, and the idea was that every Roman house had to have a hearth fire to be kept going, right? Hearth fire
Yes.
for warmth, for cooking. The hearth signified the life force of Rome. So the state had to have a hearth and had a fire to keep going. If that went out, the power, the lifeblood of Rome drained
Now, you're
out.
talking about each home.
Each home, but
Okay.
there was a central hearth, a temple in the Roman Forum for the state. So Vestas was the goddess, and there were Vestal Virgins, often 6 in number, young girls, 10 to 13, and they were picked originally from the daughters of aristocrats, but later they could be of those lower down on the social scale, and they had to stay as Vestal Virgins, these chief priestesses, for 30 years. And since they had to keep the fire and they had to maintain some sacred rituals, they're the only people who really lived in the Roman Forum. There's a pool, there was an area around it, a kind of house or apartment structure. We see statuary on bases in your view. And so they lived there for 30 years, after which that they could leave their service, go. Some of them could be married. But for the 30 years that they were Vestal Virgins, it was very key, besides keeping, these sacred rituals, hearth fire, etc., they had to remain chaste. And there are some mentions in historical sources where even if they were accused of being sexual in some ways, they were taken out of the city and buried alive in a tomb. So, and because the idea, if these young women, they are in charge of, right, the hearth and sustenance of the Roman state. That is, each Roman house as a microcosm is related to the Roman state. And if they are not pure, then
So that
the
didn't.
state, think
would
of Homeland
that didn't-
Security,
That
the
didn't
state
happen
could
too
crumble.
much.
No, well, it happened in the
who
in the
would-
80s
who
under
would
the
do
Emperor
that?
Domitian. There were a few I think 1 or 2 that were accused of not being chaste and were buried alive. These were very scandalous times, but it was taken so seriously. It was a
Yeah.
threat to national security.
So they lived in a pretty nice house.
I
it
think
looked
there were
like.
beautiful apartments. Yes,
Yeah.
there's
So they were held in very high regard.
right, and they had power. Roman women tended not to have Roman women could not be in the military. They could not be in politics, but the Vestal Virgins and a few of other priestesses were highly respected.
I once read that Julius Caesar entrusted his will to the Vestal Virgins.
I think there's something
so
to that too.
that was something
Yes.
that they also
So they had
did.
a certain kind of political clout at ceremonies, right? So they
So
were
we're-
key.
Okay, where am I now? You see, the trouble is that I'm running out of time.
Yes, and this is the Temple of Castor, and this is the kind of substructures of the Palatine Hill.
Right. Okay, so this is a good view. So in the last couple of minutes, this is what the Palatine Hill. I think I have a better view of the Palatine. Here's a better view of it.
Well,
really.
this is the Temple
here's
of
the
Vesta.
Temple of Vesta.
That is
Perfect.
mainly
Go ahead.
reconstructed in the 1930s.
So it didn't look like this. It didn't just wind up looking like this.
Well,
They reconstructed it.
Yeah, well, it seems, and it's different than the other temples. Note that it's not very high off on the ground on a big platform and steps. It's not. It's circular, so it looks like you could enter it or look at it from different views. The other temples had one main access. One you could enter it oriented towards one area, steps, and they're high rectangular structures. So this might not have been a different kind of temple with maybe an image of Vesta in it, but it located the shrine, and then right behind it was that large dwelling that we think the Vestal Virgins lived in the Roman Forum, to keep the objects, various things, sacred, and to tend to them. They also made kind of grain cakes and offerings on certain days, which sacred cakes that only the Vestal Virgins make. That would be very important.
And my last question is, because we don't have time, this was considered a great honor?
Oh,
be a
yes,
Vestal
yes,
Virgin?
yes, and to live for the 30 years in the heart of Rome, in its living center, yes. And then after 30 years, you could go and take up your life,
Well, I mean, you couldn't have children by then because you'd be in your 40s.
No, but yeah.
Okay. This is wonderful. And the time went way too fast.
Yes, I know.
So I'd like to thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you, Alan.
For everything.
It was a pleasure.
It was fun and it was wonderful. And I hope my audience enjoyed it as much as I did. And buonanotte e buona fortuna.